Hello, everybody. Yes, this is Justin Hare, Assistant for Young Adults in College Ministry at St. Philip's. I did get a slight haircut this morning and said goodbye to my COVID hair. And there will be a service of remembrance and mourning for those interested, so stay tuned. I'll talk to Jeff and see what he has to say. Anyways, I hope you're doing well. One of the great joys that I've had so far at St. Philip's has been doing instruction for baptisms. It's actually been one of the primary ways I've been able to meet many of our wonderful young adults here in the parish during this time. And today I wanted to talk a little bit about baptism. We've had a few baptisms in our congregation so far since I've been here. Due to COVID, we've had many months where the sacraments in general were deprived to the congregation. And even now, while we have resumed in-person worship and have been able to partake of Holy Communion together, most of the congregation has been deprived of partaking in the many baptisms that we've had of late. And while we rejoice that we've been able to resume baptisms privately, there ought to be a sense of longing for the day when we are able to celebrate this sacrament together again as a congregation in person. You may not realize this, but baptism is just as important for the life of the congregation as the other sacrament, Holy Communion. When someone is baptized, they are baptized into a community, into the family of faith. The congregation is very much involved in every baptism. It not only vows to support the baptismal candidate and their new life in Christ, but at the end of the baptismal service, the congregation says, "We receive you into the household of God." Baptism is a rite of initiation into a community. Christ doesn't want us to deny the children of believers into this community of faith. They are every bit of a member as we are. And that actually might change the way you think about the noises or the squirming of our littlest members in a service. But notice the last words that the congregation says to a newly baptized person. It says, "Confess the faith of Christ crucified, proclaim his resurrection, and share with us in his eternal priesthood." Growing up, I always thought that sentence had a typo in it. And that's because I missed the fact that the church not only publicly welcomes, but publicly charges the newly baptized to do something. It's almost as if this sentence needs an exclamation mark at the end of it. It's an imperative. We charge every new member who's baptized to live into their baptism, to confess and proclaim Christ in their lives, and to join us as we look to Jesus as our great high priest who forgives all our sins. And so today I wanted to spend just a couple minutes on what it means for us to live into our baptism. Just think about this question. Does your baptism make any real practical difference in your life? Well, the Apostle Paul certainly thought that it should. He frequently pointed people back to their baptism in hopes of bringing about a practical change in the present. But for how many of us does our baptism significantly shape our life? For most of us, myself included, we can't even remember our baptism because we were baptized as infants. Maybe we have a photo or two, but that's about it. How can something we don't personally remember have much of an impact on our lives? Just this past week, I was driving with my daughter in the back seat, and which is always a great place to have conversations, it seems. And she says to me, "Daddy, I want to get baptized again. I don't remember when I was baptized because I was just a baby." I actually smiled when she said this. She wanted to remember her baptism. She wanted to have some experience of it. And I smiled because I've deeply sympathized on that very issue in my own life. And the question is, how can baptism be anything but a check in the box for those of us who were baptized as infants? How can it practically help us today when we can't even recall the past event from a personal standpoint? And so to answer that question, we actually need to understand a little bit about the nature of baptism. In our world today that places such a premium on personal experience and individualism, we can forget that baptism is more about what God does than what we do. It's more about His love towards us than our love towards Him. Like communion, baptism is a sacrament. And St. Augustine called a sacrament a visible word. For Luther, it was the gospel being made visible, a picture of the gospel. So in the sacraments, we don't just hear the gospel with our ears, we see it, we smell it, we touch it, we can even taste it. The gospel, the same Jesus Christ, is in the sacraments, it's the same Jesus Christ that's in the sacraments that's in the Word. We don't get something different in the sacraments than we do in the Word. Rather, in the sacraments, we get that same Jesus, the same gospel, in a better way. God's love and grace are clearer in the sacraments than in the Word. They are more evident and more certain because they accommodate all of our senses, not just our ears. So baptism is first and foremost a sure sign of the gospel of God. It's a picture of what Jesus has done for us, rather than what we are doing for God. Well, how is the gospel acted out in baptism, you might ask? Well, in the 1662 prayer book, we have a beautiful answer. There's a beautiful prayer in the service that gives us that answer. It says, Almighty and everlasting God, who of thy great mercy saved Noah and his family in the ark from perishing by water, and also safely led the children of Israel through the Red Sea, prefiguring the sacrament of holy baptism, and by thy baptism of thy well-beloved Son, Jesus Christ, in the river Jordan, didst sanctify water to the mystical washing away of sin. What's it saying? What it's saying is baptism's about God saving His people through the waters of judgment. In Noah's day, God judged the entire world on account of their sin, and only those in the ark passed through safely. Jesus is baptized not because He needs any cleansing in Himself, rather, He identifies with His people by being baptized by John. And later in Luke's Gospel, He says, I have a baptism to be baptized with. How great is my distress until it is accomplished. Jesus' baptism by John was pointing towards His ultimate baptism, where He literally undergoes the judgment of God to save His people. And that happens at the cross. For all of us who trust and cling to Him, He becomes like the ark in which we pass through the turbulent waters of God's wrath against evil and sin. Our sins become washed away when we look to Jesus by faith. And Jesus' baptism really is not about making good people into better people, or even bad people into good people. It's about making dead people alive. It's about Jesus' death and resurrection that become our own death and resurrection when we look to Him in faith. So here's how all this can practically change your life right now. Here's how remembering your baptism can help you today, even if you can't recall the event itself. You see, remembering our baptism gives us something to hold on to when we are sinking in doubt. When we are assailed by discouragement, we can remember our baptism. It gives us something outside of ourselves to latch on to. We don't have to sink into the introspective swamp of our hearts when we lack assurance. What we need is to look outside ourselves to Christ. And baptism is precisely that promise, that Christ will save us and keep us through the turbulent waters of this world and God's judgment on sin. Baptism is not primarily about our subjective experience or the strength of our own faith. If it were, baptism would only be as strong as our own faith and would be of no help to us because we're weak people. But because it enacts the promise of the gospel more clearly, more tangibly than just hearing it, it makes the gospel easier for us to cling on to. Martin Luther, the great reformer, when he was tempted to doubt, he would shout out loud, I am baptized. And of course, it's possible to shout that out and to not have faith, which actually saves us. But those who are in despair over their sins usually have some measure of faith. And so what Luther was saying was, I have received the promise that God is for me. And if God is for me, who can possibly be against me? So you might be wondering, well, how did I distill all of that down and answer my 6-year-old daughter in the back of our car? Well, I didn't try to say all that. Here's what I said. I said, Grace Anna, I know what you're feeling too. I was baptized as a little baby as well. I don't remember what it felt like to have the water go over me, but you know what helps me? I remember that baptism is more about Jesus than it is about me or you. I remember that being baptized as a baby means that before I was able to show God anything about who I was, He took the first step towards me. And when we were as helpless as little babies, God loved us first before we did anything at all. And that makes me happy and it gives me courage. You see, she will have the opportunity to stand before the bishop one day and profess her own faith, and that's important. But baptism is about what God has done for us, how extremely secure we are in His love. Well, I hope this is an encouragement to you. May we all remember our baptisms and be assured of Christ's love for us. God bless you all, and I can't wait to see you soon.